Today is going to involve a lot of prepping, pushing, hopping, hucking, sending, squashing, and maybe the occasional plop. It will also hopefully be the end of Friday Fails as we know it, because it's time to tell you everything I can possibly think of about drops. Okay. Drops are one of the most accessible ways to catch air and give you that tasty adrenaline buzz. Oh, that's delicious, delicious. Ride fast enough at a mellow drop, hold on to a bike that can handle it tight enough, and chances are you'll roll away with a big smile on your face. But it doesn't always go that way, and when you add together bicycles, speed, air time, and mix them all together, you can end up in tears. But we don't want that, so allow me to try and convey the knowledge, understanding and methods to tackle any drop that you will come across. First of all, what is a drop? I mean, I think most people would agree that a drop is any feature that starts at a higher elevation and is a downward portion that is steep enough that catching air happens naturally or without too much effort, and a landing area that is lower in elevation than the run-in. Sounds pretty convincing, I think, yeah. But what about a flat run-in that suddenly pitches down for a long stretch and levels out way at the bottom? If you were to ride off this feature with any speeds, you would take off, land on the slope, reach the bottom, you would exclaim to your riding friends, yo, drop so deep off that. But, I mean, isn't that just a steep slope, not a drop? Maybe a drop is actually just the action of dropping elevation in the air, and anything can be a drop if you really want it to be. But I've built a feature where you drop through the air. It's called a step down. When you ride it, you would say you jumped it. A jump is not a drop. I'll let you lot debate that in the comments. God, get angry. Drop definitions aside, I'm sure everyone has a bad experience with drops at some point. One of the main things we see time and time again in Friday Fails is the classic nosedive on a drop. There's a few different factors that can cause it, but rotating forwards off a drop is just a natural thing for your bike to do. Normally, when you're riding your bike, both wheels are on the ground. Gravity is pulling you down towards the center of the earth, and everything's just peachy. But then, when you ride off a drop with no technique, gravity continues to pull you down towards that chewy center of the earth, but the front wheel has nothing to hold it up. As your center of mass is between the two wheels and the back wheel is still being supported, the bike and rider will naturally rotate forward. And that rotation will accelerate for as long as that back wheel remains on the ground. If the back wheel has left the ground, that rotation will stop accelerating, but the rider and bike will just keep rotating until that bike touches down again. And oh boy, you better hope in that situation that your center of mass is behind the contact patch of that front wheel, or you're gonna have a bad time. So if this rotation happens and accelerates as long as the back wheel is still on the ground, that means if you go faster, the back wheel will be on the ground for less time and there won't be as much rotation. This is a viable tactic, and going faster off drops does often make them easier, but I still wouldn't call it controlled. The goal with drops is to land balanced, which usually means both wheels landing at about the same time. The first bit of technique riders usually naturally develop on drops to achieve this is to lessen the effect of their body weight on that rotation equation. This can be done by shifting the weight back and down as the front wheel leaves the ground, and keep that movement going until the back wheel also leaves the ground. This looks to the casual observer as if the back wheel just comes up right to the rider's bum. This action moves the center of mass closer to the back wheel, which reduces the leverage that gravity has when rotating that bike forward, which slows down the acceleration of that rotation. If you could move your mass even further and get over the back axle, well, then you'd remove all forward rotation, because that's a manual and it's sick. And another way to do drops without doing that quarter front flip onto your face. Probably get to that in the future though. So moving the weight back works nicely, but why move the weight down as well? This quick downward movement momentarily unweights your body to a certain degree. It's very hard to explain this effect, but the act of vertically coiling up your body pulls your head and feet towards your center of mass. if you do this at the correct speed, for a moment, you will be temporarily weightless as far as your bike is concerned. Ever seen someone let go of a stretched out slinky and the bottom just sort of hovers there as it coils up? It's kind of like that. If you are momentarily weightless, there's no weight going down into the bike, so there's no force to rotate you and the bike forward. Make sense? Yeah? Pretty cool. Don't do it like that. Don't. You can only maintain that weightless moment for however much room you have available before you hit that back wheel with your bump. If this is your default dropping technique, you will get to a drop, discover you're going too slow, and you will run out of room before your back wheel has cleared the drop at some point. This is what causes some of the most violent crashes on drops, as when the back wheel makes contact with those cheeks, it's like locking up that back brake, which throws your weight forward and usually sends you out the front door. And then you're going to get real friendly with the ground. Running out of room between the bum and the back wheel happens a lot on drops, and there's a super common mistake that a lot of people do that needs to be highlighted. Drops can be scary, and the most common reaction to being scared on a bike is to move away from that thing that scares you. I mean, it makes sense. It's a scary thing there. Well, I'm just going to be over here. I'll be over here. Yeah. It's the worst thing you can do. If you insist on doing that previous technique, at least give yourself a chance. Be brave and begin the move from the boss stance. And if you don't know what that is, you should probably go watch the other videos in the series. Body position, it's a good one. So if that previous technique isn't up to snuff because of what happens when you're going slower, well, I mean, what are the options? Well, there's this little trick you can do that I see a lot of people using that unweights both the wheels and the rider. Whoa, wait. You're just going to explain this in minute detail so that you can then go wrong and feel all smug about yourself, aren't you? Yeah. Who's the douchebag now? Hi, it's you. I'm the douchebag. So yeah, a lot of riders will use a two-wheel unweight or even a full English bunny hop, lifting both wheels off the ground at the same time to try and keep things level as they float off a drop. And as my colleague graciously pointed out, this is not the ideal technique, but it is a great move to have as a backup to get you off a small steep drop when maybe you've made a mistake, arrived with not enough speed, but you can't stop and you need to do something to get safely off of it. This technique has the shortest preparation time for what it can accomplish, but it shouldn't be your default. There's two reasons I don't recommend it as your default technique. When you hop or unweight the bike, you lift your mass up higher. The higher up you are before you drop, the harder you're going to come down, which is fine if there's a landing that you're trying to hit the sweet spot of, but if it's a flat landing, then it's just going to make the landing harsher. The other reason is a two-wheel unweight or hop has to happen a full bike length before the drop. This means you have to be sure your timing is right because you don't want the back wheel to clip the edge of that drop and cause any heart attacks. Other solutions to this problem include a mellow manualing technique or front wheel lift. I mentioned this before, and it puts just enough energy to lift the front wheel up for a bike length, and then as the front wheel begins to drop back to what would be the ground, the back wheel also leaves the drop and both wheels fall evenly together. This can work well, especially if you're trying to get a bit more height and distance off the drop to clear an obstacle or make it to a landing. But in that situation, we're getting closer to jumping techniques, so we're going to save that for the next video. If you ride trials, there is another variation you'll have used to lift the front wheel, which is similar to the manual, a bit more complicated, the good old pedal wheelie. It performs the exact same job as the manual, but it has a bit more inherent risk. Generally speaking, you would only ever need to do this if you're going too slow for the other techniques to work. And if you're not prepared, by selecting the correct gear, it might be too hard a gear. You ever tried to wheelie in a hard gear? Yeah, well you ain't getting it up, and there's nothing worse than a floppy drop. I was really pleased when I wrote that last night. Or no, it was this morning. Right, now we get to it. The holy grail of drop-in techniques. So adaptable and controlled, elegant and smooth. The technique of choice is the push. Let's break down the what, how, and why. So the method for doing the exaggerated form of this technique firstly involves some preparation just before the drop. You need to bend the arms and legs to lower yourself down and forward into the bike. This coils you up like a spring and allows you to put plenty of movement into that push. Why push the bike forward? Well, this action speeds the bike up for a moment, which reduces the time that the front wheel is unsupported while the back wheel is still on the ground, which will limit how much forward rotation can be generated. The further forward you prepare, the more energy you can put into the push, but you only really need the massively exaggerated pushes when you're going really slow. At speed, a small dip forward and a mellow push is usually all that's needed. The takeoff technique isn't finished though, as the push itself is just half of the equation and mainly focuses on the arms. The legs still have a little bit of work to do to unweight the bike as the back wheel is coming off the drop. Remember that first technique where the rider brings the bum down towards the back wheel? Well, you just add in a bit of that towards the end of the push by bending the legs a little, just as the back wheel's coming off the drop. Now that might sound very complicated, and it's very hard to practice a complicated move on a scary feature. So I recommend you practice this on something well within your comfort zone. It's also good to pull from other skills that feel very similar to help develop this new technique easier. This pushing technique is very similar to absorbing a roller. It feels like you're absorbing the edge of the drop, and then instead of pushing the bike down the backside of a roller, you're pushing the bike forward to keep the bike level in the air. Talking of pushing the bike forward, I need to add a little asterisk on that one. You actually want to push the bike at the angle of the ground that you intend to land on. That means if it's a flat landing, yes, push the bike horizontally forward. But if it's a steeper downward landing, you want to push the bike at the angle of the landing slope so that the bike matches the angle. It's usually better to land both wheels at the same time, or sometimes front wheel first. Landing back wheel first can soften certain landings and look cool in certain situations, but that front wheel is your control wheel, and when it's not on the ground, it's hard to fix any mistakes you might have made. So, hopefully at this point, the push technique is making sense and you now have a good idea of how to take off in a controlled manner. That's the hard bit. Now we've got to get things ready for landing. One of the benefits of this pushing technique is once you are clear of the drop, you should be in a low position on the bike. And from this position, you can extend your legs, bring the bike back underneath you so that you land centered in the bike and effectively place the bike smoothly back on the ground. This is something you can't do as effectively with the other techniques, and it really helps to smooth out drops. If you watch from the side and trace a line tracking close to the center of mass, you should see that the line traced by the push is so much smoother than the other techniques. Let's do some examples. Point out the key things, make you aware of any common mistakes, and just make sure that you're ready to take this to any feature. You got to approach drops with caution, because you just don't know whether... Oh. You don't want to spook it. Before me is, I guess, a roller, because you can roll this. You can come in, slow down, and you can just roll on down that. But once you go above a certain speed, you're taking off. And at that point, it's a drop. And you can use dropping technique to get this really good, because there's no landing for this. There's no point pulling up off of this, unless you're going to take a sneaky line. But we'll get to that in a second. You want to absorb this, control the bike off it so you go off of it nice and level and place that bike back down on the ground as best as you can. So let's go through the steps for this drop. So I'm going to come in, default body position, coming in nice and relaxed. If I want to do any braking, I do so on the run up, because you don't want to brake while you're doing the movement, because if you brake as you're doing it, it's probably going to pitch you forward. Another thing that can cause a big nosedive. So I've done my brake and I'm coming up to the edge. Then I want to do my prep work. So I'm going to dip down and forward, and that's going to allow me to then push the bike off of it. So the timing for it, you don't want to do it before the edge. And the reason for that is if I start pushing like, I don't know, a foot or so before, I'm going to run out of that movement before the bike is fully off of it. You want to wait until just at the edge before pushing. So just as the front wheel's coming off the edge, that's when I'm going to push the bike forward and slightly down, because the run out isn't flat, it is slightly down. I want to push the bike at the angle of it. And I actually personally prefer to get the front wheel down slightly earlier, so I'm going to push down a little bit. Push the bike forward, and as I'm pushing with the arms, the legs are coming up and the back wheel's coming up towards my bum to like soak up the edge of that drop. I'm off of it, I've done it, I'm in the air, everything's looking good. Extending the bike out to the ground, landing centered, and actually For this one, I land with my weight a little bit back because I got to get on the brakes because there's another spicy feature coming up. So that's why you always have to adjust the techniques. You've got to understand the principles so you can tweak it for what the trail's doing. So I'm going to land weight back a little bit and on the brakes. So the things you got to watch out for when trying to do this technique, when I've tried to teach people in the past, I'll say, right, you want to get down and then you want to push the bike forward and absorb it. And what they sometimes do is when you're used to just springing off of stuff, is they'll go to push, but they'll push themselves like up and back and they'll still add a bit of spring. So don't push down with the legs. It should be all absorbing and pushing. So if you feel yourself springing up, or you get a person to film you and you can see that happening, really focus on, as you're pushing with the arms, the legs stay relaxed. So yeah, other classic mistakes, forgetting to prepare before or coming in a little bit tentative. You've got to get right forward. And in terms of timing, when you're practicing this, it can be good to prepare early, just so you've got time to think of everything. But for proper timing, you want to be coming in quite tall and relaxed, so you're able to really dip down through the edge of the drop, because you want your body to be going diagonally through the feature, and that's what allows you to put the bike back on the ground nice and quick. The amount that you prepare will dictate how much you kind of absorb the feature, or how much you kind of neutralize the feature, or how early you can get the bike back on the ground. Because the more you absorb it, the lower your torso is and the quicker you can push the bike back on the ground. But there's a line here where you can jump over the stump on the inside, because it's a really fast line and it's sick and it looks mint. If I was to fully absorb it like the way I would normally do, so if I would do that pushing technique, I would hit the stump and have a bad time. So you can actually use that absorbing technique, but just dial it down. Just dip into the bike a little bit and then give it a gentle push so that you go a little bit further, but you are still making things controlled and smooth. So you can adjust the technique to kind of fit exactly what you want to do. And that's it. That's drops. That's the push. Push it real good. Well, that is absolutely everything I could possibly think of about drops. So I hope you found it interesting and learned something new. If you did, drop down into those comments. Let us know what you liked or what you didn't like. And you might as well push one of those thumb button icons while you're there. Now it's up to you. Take your bicycle out into the wilderness, practice the technique on a familiar drop, get it as smooth and controlled as possible, build up to bigger ones, challenge yourself. Don't panic, maintain the technique, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video. It's the big one. It's jumps. Complicated subject. Hard to put into words. I'm trying though. The script is almost there. Really long. Jumps are good though. I actually don't know who that is. So, I don't know if this is a meme. We see it in the comments all the time. If you're on a hardtail, exactly the same. It is. If you're on a fat bike, exactly the same. If you're on an e-bike, I know you don't like them, exactly the same. The technique's the same. If it's a two-wheeled vehicle, you can do the same technique. Actually, if you're in Australia, you have to do everything backwards. You know, it's like the Coriolis effect. So it's like you don't absorb it, the bike absorbs into, yeah.